This is Octatonicism and the Carillon, presented by Tom Gurin for the Guild of Carillonneurs in North America. My background, I studied music composition at Yale University. I was co-chair of the Yale University Guild of Carillonneurs. I've been a member of the GCNA since 2017, and then after graduation from Yale, I studied at the Royal Carillon School, Jeff Denane. So there are going to be basically three purposes for this presentation. The first one is just going to be a general introduction to Octatonicism. What does that mean when I say Octatonicism or the Octatonic scale? What is its history? And so just a general introduction to all of that in just a broader classical music context. And then we're going to get into the Carillon repertoire and how that plays into Carillon music, who brought it, how they used it. There are basically two stories here. The European side, Henk Boddings is really the leading figure through Toccata Octofonica, and then Summer Fanfares by Roy Hamlin Johnson is what kind of brought octatonic music onto the scene in the carillon world in the United States. And then the third purpose is to answer kind of why all this is important and what are the conclusions and implications of this presentation. And to do that, we're going to briefly touch on Fantasia Octatonica by John Corder. So we're going to dive into the introduction to Octatonicism. So the octatonic scale is something that I first encountered in music theory class at Yale. It's not at all specific to the carillon. In fact, it's most commonly associated with Igor Stravinsky, and a lot of Russian composers in the 19th and 20th century used it. The idea is basically to alternate whole and half steps until you get back to the octave. So if you start on C, you have two options. You can either start with a whole step or start with a half step. But if you start with a whole step, it'll be C, D, E flat, F, F sharp, G sharp, A, B natural. And there are 8 notes there, hence octatonic, in a diatonic scale, major or minor, typical kind of a regular scale. There are only going to be 7 notes before you reach the octave. So that's the first kind of melodic definition of Octatonicism. The other way of thinking about it is kind of through harmony and say, okay, it's really built on the combination of 2 fully diminished 7th chords. And a fully diminished 7th chord, if you don't know what that is, it's just, it's a 4-note chord, and you basically stack minor thirds up and up and up. So it's a very simple kind of chord. The cool thing about it is there are only actually 3 of them. So you can kind of think about it as if you start on C, you have this E flat, G flat, B double flat, or A natural. But if you move that C up to the top, it still stays the same kind of chord. It's just built on E flat now. So you can kind of think of it like you can start on C, C sharp, or D, and then they just start repeating. So there are 3 distinct fully diminished 7th chords, and if you combine any 2 of them, you get an octatonic scale. So that's the harmonic way of looking at it. We're going to talk about this section of this piece, Boris Godunov, is an opera by Modest Mussorgsky, and there's this is one of the first octatonic examples in all of classical music. And what's really interesting about this is it's actually trying to imitate the sound of bells. This is a coronation bell scene. So what he's trying to do is use the orchestra, use the octatonic scale to make it sound like there are real bells. And so what you're looking at is a piano reduction of the full score. But you can kind of hear what he's doing. So let's give it a listen. you can kind of hear those bells, right? And now, how does this kind of relate to carillon music? Well, the minor third overtone is really what it comes down to. If you have a sort of natural instrument, for example, like a violin or a wind column, anything that is a simple natural instrument, it follows a natural harmonic scale, natural harmonic series for its overtones. So that would be, you start with the octave, then the fifth, then the fourth, and they get quieter and quieter as they go up. So this is kind of getting a little bit into musical acoustics, but just because you hear one note on a violin doesn't mean there aren't an infinite number of frequencies also sounding. And that, the relative amplitude or volume of those higher notes is what makes instruments sound different. But that really only applies to these natural, simplistic instrument setups where you have a vibrating column of air or a vibrating string. For something like a percussion instrument or something that's a very complex instrument that's vibrating like a bell, you throw all of that out. So for bells, they're man-made, and all of the overtones are tuned by hand by the bell tuner. And over the centuries, bell founders and bell tuners have come up with this standard sequence for a perfectly tuned bell. And the first 5 overtones are here on your screen. The really important one is the minor third overtone. It's very loud, it's very prominent, it's very low in the overtone series compared to in the natural harmonic series. It would be way higher up and therefore much quieter. So the minor third is very prominent in bells. Matthias van den Gheyn was a composer. We all know his preludes. What you're looking at is Preludio number 10, but he was also a bell tuner, and I think that's part of the reason he was such an innovative composer for the carillon, because he was so aware of this minor third overtone and its prominence in the structure and the timbre of bells. He actually uses these diminished seventh arpeggios very frequently. So if you look at the left hand and then going into the feet, he's actually outlining a fully diminished seventh arpeggio. He goes down and then back up, and then he switches to a different fully diminished seventh arpeggio. So this is not octatonic writing, but it's not that far off, considering that all of these chords are going to sustain indefinitely. So let's give this a listen. So that technique of using these fully diminished seventh chords to line up with cross bell overtones. So the F bell is going to line up really nicely with the minor third overtone of the D bell, for example. That allows a really nice blending. And if we look back at the coronation bell scene from Boris Godunov, we're actually looking at the same chords. Obviously, they're much more integrated in this Mussorgsky example, which makes them truly octatonic. But it's interesting that they kind of wrote the same sort of chord structure. So this is kind of a fun way of looking at octatonicism. Matthias van den Gheyn was using diminished seventh chords, which gives you 4 notes to work with. And if you combine all 3 possible diminished seventh chords, you get 12-tone music, a chromatic scale, and that gives you a ton of musical opportunities. There's a picture of Arnold Schoenberg, who's famous for that. But it's on a carillon, it would sound a little bit crazy. So what is in the middle. If you just have two diminished seventh chords, you still have that that blending of the bell sounds, but it's not too crazy sounding. So that's kind of where Octatonicism fits into this puzzle. So we're going to move on now to the second purpose of this presentation. We're going to talk about Octatonicism in the Carillon world. We're going to start with Europe, and then we're going to move to the American world. So, first of all, who are these people who are writing octatonic music for the Carillon? At first, they weren't Carillonneurs at all. Actually, they were academically trained musicians who went through conservatories. Henk Boddings, in his case, was actually taking lessons with Willem Pijper, who, if you have played or spent some time studying in the Netherlands, they actually call the octatonic scale the Pijper scale. So that tells you how deeply associated Willem Pijper is with Octatonicism. Roy Hamlin Johnson got his bachelor, master, and doctorate of music from Eastman, so he went through that full conservatory route. Neither of them were Carillonneurs. And why weren't Carillonneurs coming up with this? Why is it these academic composers who have to come in and say, hey, this is a cool idea, it might sound neat? Well, part of it is the training, but part of it is also this idea that Carillonneurs can listen through. So what we like to talk about sometimes is when we're playing, we hear all this mess of overtones and everything like a bombarding waves of overtones coming at us. And we have to be able to sort through all of that and get to the strike note so that we can know if we're playing the wrong note, essentially. So we kind of get into that habit. But that actually reduces our awareness of the minor third overtone. So for a casual listener, maybe they don't have necessarily ear training, they aren't musically literate sometimes, and they're just kind of passing by. They aren't particularly aware of it either, obviously. Now, if you look at a trained composer who has never heard a carillon before and isn't in this habit of listening through, they're going to be, I've worked with composers a lot, and when I bring them up and start playing for them, they're like, wow, this minor third overtone, I just can't get past it. Similarly, bell founders, bell tuners, they have to be aware of those overtones. So what I'm arguing is that casual listeners and actual performers like ourselves are not necessarily the most aware of this minor third overtone. And the reason that you have Borden and Mussorgsky and this is Matthias van Gheyn and Modest Mussorgsky, if you have those two people that are really aware, a composer and a bell founder, they're really aware of the minor third overtone. So now we're going to look at two ways that the octatonic scale can be used in carillon music, and one is to draw attention away from harmony, which is what Henk Boddings did. The other is to draw attention towards harmony, and that's what happened in the case of Roy Hamlin Johnson's Summer Fanfares. So Henk Boddings' Octatonicism is not ostentatious at all. It's very, almost like it dilutes the awareness of harmony. And on top of that, he kind of like lays a foundation of just this swirl, this constant river of octatonic notes flowing, and then builds his music on top of that. And we're gonna return to that idea. But first, the basic biography of his life. He was Dutch. He was born in Java. He was a very talented student in a lot of ways. He was actually an engineer before he got into composition. So in 1931, he had his first taste of success. A huge amount of acclaim came for his cello concerto, which was premiered at the Royal Concertgebouw. At that point, he decides, maybe this is something I could be good at. He starts working with Willem Pijper, who the Pijper scale is named for. And the Pijper scale, again, is the same as the octatonic scale. He then pursues a a successful career in music and was actually the director of the Music Lyceum in Amsterdam. And he also had a position at the Rotterdam Conservatory. Now, he was obviously listening to carillons in passing his entire life, but he didn't actually write a carillon composition until a composition contest was put on by Stoffnace at the Royal Carillon School, Germantown. And that's how Toccata Octofonica came to be. So we're going to look at the score in just a second, but kind of a preview here is, as I said, he's really not interested in saying that much about harmony. He uses the octatonic scale kind of as a constant flowing 16th note texture. On top of that, he builds really interesting counterpoints and contours. So here's the score. Most of it is very constant motion. It's in ternary form, although it's really not clear exactly where these lines are. In my opinion, this is where they fall, but it's a little bit hazy. There's the octatonic scale that he's using. And what's really the most salient characteristic of this piece is the contour. So for the first couple of pages, it's generally downward motion in the pedals. So the loudest bells are continuously descending. And then on the third page, you suddenly have this upward motion in the feet. So it creates kind of this large-scale inverted wave pattern. Meanwhile, we're going to look at that section in a little bit more detail, but the hands are doing something completely different, and he's constantly playing with these different kinds of counterpoint, moving in opposite directions or oblique motion. So that's really what he's interested in with this piece, is contour, counterpoint, generally directions and combinations of voices moving in the same or different directions. Harmony, not super interested in it. So here's the beginning. So you can kind of hear that downward motif that keeps coming back. Now this is the section that was rectangled in red on the previous screen. What's really neat about this section is you can really tell he's playing around with upward motion, downward motion. The feet in this section are constantly descending while the hands are playing out this almost drama of trying to rise, trying to get up. And the next measure, or two measures later, they just completely tumble down. So it's really not about octatonicism. Yes, he's using it, but he's really just kind of creating a wash of 16th note texture. My personal opinion is he probably didn't want to draw attention to the harmony because at that time in the early mid-20th century in the Netherlands, a lot of carillons were out of tune. So he was probably listening to these carillons at that time and think, wow, I don't think I could write a piece for that instrument where harmony is actually central. So he uses the octatonic scale to sort of dilute what most people are usually listening to, which is going to be the pull from 5 to 1, this harmonic tension. He doesn't want to deal with that at all with the carillon. He's mainly interested in counterpoint and contour. So that's his strategy. Completely changing directions. Roy Hamlin Johnson uses octatonicism for octatonicism's sake. He's really interested in harmony, non-functional harmony to be specific. But first, before we get into that, a brief biography of his life. He unfortunately passed away this past January, but he was born in West Virginia. As I said, he was an academic musician his whole life. He was in the Eastman Conservatory for all of his education. He studied composition with Wayne Barlow, even though he was a piano performance student. Wayne Barlow is known for encouraging the use of irregular or less commonly used scales, such as Octatonicism. And actually, John Posdro, who was another composer at the University of Kansas, while Roy Hamlin Johnson was there, also studied with Wayne Barlow and also used Octatonic music for the Carillon. So the most important figure in this picture is Ronald Barnes. He was at the center of it. He was the Carillonneur at the University of Kansas while Johnson was there. He encouraged Johnson to write for the Carillon, and they actually ate lunch together most days. So they were working together quite a lot. And from that relationship came Summer Fanfares, which is only 6 years after Toccata Octofonica, which sounds like it could be a while, but actually they never talked to each other. Hank Boddings and Roy Hamlin Johnson, there's no indication they ever spoke or met or had any communication whatsoever. So they kind of came to the same conclusion independently of each other, and in a relatively short period of time, these two Carillon worlds both were working in octatonic writing. It's kind of amazing. So before we look at the score, the most important factors in Summer Fanfares are actually harmony, rhythm, and form. So unlike Toccata Octofonica, Roy Hamlin Johnson is fascinated by using non-functional harmony, which means harmony chords that aren't about 5-1 motion from dominant to tonic. He does want to get away with that, does want to get away from that, and he uses Octatonicism to help that happen. But the chords themselves, even though they aren't using a tonic, dominant, tonic pull, they're still very central. On top of that, he's using ostinato rhythms, so these very repetitive, you'll see on the score, but very repetitive rhythms and going 4 against 3 rhythms. The form isn't ternary, but that's about all it has in common with Toccata Octofonica. The most important thing about this piece for our purposes is his really ostentatious use of Octatonicism. And the most dissonant chord in the piece is the Petrushka Chord, which is named after the ballet by Igor Stravinsky, and it's built using 2 major triads smashed together, and they are a tritone apart. So it's a very dissonant chord, but he uses it very brashly. So we're going to take a look at the score now. This is the ternary form. It's very clear, and it's clear because of these Petrushka chords. Petrushka Chord. It stands out. It's in the lowest register as well. And he's using that chord to help define the ternary form. Whenever the Petrushka chord happens, that means it's the end of a section. And he does that 3 times throughout the piece. So the big takeaway here is harmony is actually really playing a huge role in this piece, what he's saying through his musical composition. It's not functional harmony, but it is still a real interest in the harmonic content of each chord, and he's not trying to dilute that. He's really trying to bring that, as well as the bell overtones, into the fore. So, to sum up, composers from an academic background, as opposed to carillonneurs, were the ones bringing Octatonicism into carillon music. They saw this challenge of bell overtones having this really strong minor third, and they came up with the same solution, independent of each other, to use Octatonicism, but in very different ways. So now we're on the third and final section of this presentation, the why. Why does any of this matter? We're going to look at Fantasia Octatonica very briefly to try to answer that question. And we're going to actually do that while comparing it to Boris Godunov, that opera we looked at earlier, the Coronation Bell section. And if you compare these two, what you're actually going to see is they're the same exact chords. So it's kind of telling, actually, that the Mussorgsky piece is trying to imitate bells using these chords, and then John Corder comes in and starts using these same chords on actual bells. What does that mean? Does that make bells sound more like bells? Not necessarily. What he's actually doing is using those chords and those harmonies to manipulate the blending and clashing of the instrument. So you could say that using those harmonies in a carillon context helps all the bells kind of sound like one big bell, but not really. It's really just about blending the sound together, and that can be extremely useful as a tool for composers. That said, clashing is not a bad thing all the time. There are very beautiful carillon pieces that are all about clashing overtones, and that's arguably one of the most present and important characteristics of the carillon is all those overtones and the complexity of those. And by reducing that, there are advantages and disadvantages. So that's the presentation. I do want to thank Koen Kozart, who was my advisor for this, originated as a thesis for the Royal Carillon School, Jeff Deneen, as well as John Gowans, who has just been a great resource. So there's going to be a Q&A section next. Thank you for watching.